In this segment, we're going to talk about groupings of stars that appear on the HR diagram. Let's look at an HR diagram from your textbook. The first thing you should notice is that we see this line of stars that goes from upper left to bottom right, and these are called the main sequence of stars. The main sequence of stars are stars that are basically stable in radius. The Sun sits on the main sequence. It is a main sequence star. Another grouping of stars are these supergiant stars. Supergiant stars are exceptional, 10 to 1,000 times the Sun's diameter. So they are very, very bright and they are very large. Another grouping of stars are giant stars. Giant stars are large, cool, and highly luminous stars, but not as luminous as supergiants. And they are only about 10 to 100 times the diameter of the Sun, so they're not as large as supergiants. Now, between the giant stars and the main sequence of stars is a grouping of stars, not labeled, and we'll call these subgiant stars. They're not as large as giant stars, and they're not as luminous as giant stars, so we call them subgiants. Below the main sequence of stars, we see another grouping of stars called white dwarfs. A white dwarf is the remains of a dying star that has collapsed to the size of the Earth and is slowly cooling off over time. These are your general groupings of stars that are on the HR diagram. Notice that these supergiants, the giants, the subgiants, the main sequence, the white dwarfs, they all have a different luminosity on the HR diagram. So let's look at luminosity classes. Luminosity classes are given Roman numerals. Luminosity class 1A is a very luminous supergiant. Luminosity class 1A would be the supergiants that appear at the very top of the diagram. A luminosity class 1B is not quite as luminous of a supergiant. So a luminosity class 1B would be below the 1A. Notice that these are not drawn to scale. Luminosity class Roman numeral 2 is a luminous giant. Luminous giants will be the brightest of the giant class, and so luminous giant would be given the Roman numeral 2 class. Luminosity class Roman numeral 3 is a giant star. It is not as luminous as your Roman numeral 2. Luminosity class Roman numeral 4 is a subgiant. And remember, the subgiants appear between the main sequence and between the giant stars. And this is the location of the subgiants. Roman numeral 5 is the main sequence of stars. And as we had discussed before, that would be everything along the main sequence. That would be luminosity class 5. So these luminosity classes give you a general idea of the comparison of the luminosities of the different types or groupings of stars on the HR diagram. Now the main sequence has many different stars on them of various different colors of Roy G. Biv. So the red stars that are on the main sequence are given a name called red dwarfs. And you can say the same thing for the orange dwarfs, and the yellow dwarfs, and the green dwarfs, and the blue dwarfs, the indigo dwarfs, and the violet dwarfs. Now below this main sequence of Roy G. Biv dwarfs is a grouping of stars that we call subdwarfs. And this is going to have a luminosity class 6. And remember this grouping of white dwarfs down here? Those are going to have a luminosity class 7. So let's add those two to our list. So remember, luminosity classes are Roman numerals, whereas spectral classes are letters, O, B, A, F, G, K, M. And we can add the spectral classes of L, which half are for the least luminous stars, and the other half category of L are for brown dwarfs. T's are for brown dwarfs, and we can add the Y class for objects less massive than brown dwarfs, such as planets. And there we have luminosity classes versus spectral classes of stars on the HR diagram.